quote, to be avant-garde means to keep abreast of reality, unquote. Internationale Situationniste 8. A radical critique of the modern world must have the totality as its object and objective. Its searchlight must reveal the world's real past, its present existence, and the prospect for its transformation as an indivisible whole. If we are to reach the whole truth about the modern world, and a fortiori if we are to formulate the project of its total subversion, we must be able to expose its hidden history. In concrete terms, this means subjecting the history of the international revolutionary movement as set in motion over a century ago by the Western proletariat to a demystified and critical scrutiny. Quote, this movement against the total organization of the world came to a stop long ago, unquote. Internationale Situationniste 1. It failed. Its last historical appearance was the Spanish Social Revolution, crushed in the Barcelona, quote, Maydays, unquote, in 1937. Yet, its so-called victories and defeats, if judged in the light of their historical consequences, tend to confirm Liebknecht's remarks the day before his assassination that, quote, some defeats are really victories, while some victories are more shameful than any defeat, unquote. Thus, the first great failure of workers' power, the Paris Commune, is in fact the greatest success, whereby the primitive proletariat proclaimed its historical capacity to organize all aspects of social life freely. And the Bolshevik Revolution, hailed as the proletariat's first great triumph, turns out in the last analysis to be the most disastrous of defeats. The installation of the Bolshevik order coincides with the crushing of the Spartakists by the German, quote, Social Democrats, unquote. The joint victory of Bolshevism and Reformism constitutes a unity masked by an apparent incompatibility, for the Bolshevik order too, as it transpired, was to be a variation of the old theme. The effects of the Russian counter-revolution were internally the institution and development of a new mode of exploitation, bureaucratic state capitalism, and externally the growth of the, quote, communist, unquote, international, whose spreading branches served a unique purpose of defending and reproducing the rotten trunk. Capitalism, under its bourgeois and bureaucratic guises, won a new lease on life. Over the dead bodies of the sailors of Kronstadt, the Ukrainian peasants, and the workers of Berlin, Kiel, Turin, Shanghai, and Barcelona. The Third International, apparently created by the Bolsheviks to combat the degenerate reformism of its predecessor and unite the avant-garde of the proletariat in, quote, revolutionary communist parties, unquote, was too closely linked to its interests of the founders to ever serve the authentic socialist revolution. Despite all its polemics, the Third International was a chip off the old block. The Russian model was rapidly imposed on the Western workers' organizations, and the evolution of both was thenceforward one and the same thing. The totalitarian dictatorship of the bureaucratic class over the Russian proletariat found its echo in the subjugation of the great mass of workers in other countries to castes of trade union and political functionaries with their own private interests in repression. While the Stalinist monster haunted the working class consciousness, old-fashioned capitalism was becoming bureaucratized and overdeveloped, resolving its famous internal contradictions and proudly proclaiming its victory to be decisive today. Though the unity is obscured by apparent variations and oppositions, a single social form is coming to dominate the world. This modern world which it proposes to govern with the principles of the world long dead and gone, the tradition of the dead generation still weighs like a nightmare on the minds of the living. Opposition to the world offered from within, and in its own terms by supposedly revolutionary organizations, can only be spurious. Such opposition depending on the worst mystification and calling on more or less reified ideologies helps consolidate the social order. Trade unions and political parties created by the working class as tools of its emancipation are now no more than, quote, checks and balances, unquote, of the system. Their leaders have made these organizations their private property, their stepping stone to a role within the ruling class. The party programs or trade union statute may contain vestiges of revolutionary phraseology, but their practice is everywhere reformist, and doubly so now that the official capitalist ideology mouths the same reformist slogan, where the unions have seized power in countries more backward than Russia in 1917. The Stalinist model of counter-revolutionary totalitarianism has been faithfully reproduced elsewhere. They have become the static complement to the self-regulation of managerial capitalism. The official organizations have become the best guarantee of repression without the, quote, opposition, unquote, to the humanist democratic facade of the system. Without this, quote, opposition, unquote, the humanist democratic facade of the system would collapse, and its essential violence would be laid bare. In the struggle with the militant proletariat, these organizations are the unfailing defenders of the bureaucratic counter-revolution and the docile creatures of its foreign policy. They are the bearers of the most blatant falsehoods in a world of lies, working diligently for the perennial and universal dictatorship of the state and the economy. As the Situationists put it, quote, a universally dominant social system tending towards totalitarian self-regulation is apparently being resisted, but only apparently. by false forms of opposition which remain trapped on the battlefield ordained by the system itself. Such illusionary resistance can only serve to reinforce what it pretends to attack. Bureaucratic pseudo-socialism is only the most grandiose of guises of the world of hierarchy and alienated labor, unquote. As for student unionism, it is nothing but the travesty of a travesty, the useless burlesque of a trade unionism itself long totally degenerate. The principal platitude of all future revolutionary organization must be the theoretical and practical denunciation of Stalinism in all its forms. In France, at least, where economic backwardness has slowed down the consciousness of crisis, the only possible road is over the ruins of Stalinism. I must become the Delinda est Carthago of the last revolution of prehistory. Revolution must break with its past and derive all its poetry from the future. Little groups of, quote, militants, unquote, who claim to represent the authentic Bolshevik heritage are voices from beyond the grave. These angels who come to avenge the, quote, betrayal, unquote, of the October Revolution will always support the defense of the USSR if only, quote, in the last instance, unquote, the, quote, underdeveloped, unquote, nations are their promised land. They can scarcely sustain their illusions outside this context, where their objective role is to buttress theoretical underdevelopment. They struggle for the dead body of, quote, Trotsky, unquote, and invent 1,000 variations of the same ideological theme, and end up with the same brand of political and theoretical impotence. 40 years of counter-revolution separates these groups from revolution. Since this is not 1920, they can only be wrong. And they were already wrong in 1920. Consider the fate of an ultra-leftist group like Socialisme ou Barbarie, where after the departure from, quote, traditional Marxist, unquote, faction, the impetus of pouvoir ouvrier, a core of revolutionary, quote, modernists, unquote, under Cardin, disintegrated and disappeared within 18 months. While the old categories are no longer revolutionary, a rejection of Marxism a la Cardin is no substitute for the reinvention of a total critique. The Scylla and Charybdis of present revolutionary action are the museum of revolutionary prehistory and modernism of the system itself. As for the various anarchist groups, they possess nothing beyond a pathetic ideological faith in this label. They justify every kind of self-contradiction in liberal terms, freedom of speech, of opinion, and other bric-a-brac. Since they tolerate each other, they would tolerate anything. The predominant social system, which flatters itself on its modernization and its preeminence, must now be confronted with a worthy enemy, the equally modern negative force which it produces. Let the dead bury their dead. The advance of history has a practical demystifying effect. It helps exorcise the ghosts which haunt the revolutionary consciousness. Thus, the revolution of everyday life comes face to face with the enormity of its task. The revolutionary project must be reinvented, as much as the life it announces. If the project is still essential to the abolition of class society, it is because the material conditions upon which the revolution was based are still with us. But revolution must be conceived with a new coherence and a new radicalism, starting with a clear grasp of the failure of those who first began it. Otherwise, its fragmentary realization will bring about a new division of society. The fight between the powers that be and the new proletariat can only be in terms of the totality. And for this reason, the future revolutionary movement must be purged of any tendency that reproduces within itself the alienation produced by the commodity system. It must be the living critique of that system and the negation of it, carrying all elements essential for its transitions. As Lukács correctly showed, revolutionary organization is this necessary mediation between theory and practice, between men and history, between the dams of workers and the proletariat constituted as a class. Lukács' mistake was to believe that the Bolsheviks fulfilled this role. If they are to be real, iced-in-practice, quote, theoretical, unquote, tendencies or differences must be translated into organizational problems. It is by its present organization that a new revolutionary movement will stand or fall. The final criterion of its coherence will be the compatibility of its actual form with its essential project, the international absolute power of workers' councils, as foreshadowed by the proletarian revolutions of the last 100 years. There can be no compromise with the foundations of the existing society. The system of commodity production, ideology in all its guises, the state, and the imposed division of labor from leisure. The rock on which the old revolutionary movement floundered was the separation of theory and practice. Only at the supreme moments of struggle did the proletarians supersede this division and attain their truths. As a rule, the principle seems to have been hic Rhodus hic non salata. Ideology, however, quote, revolutionary, unquote, always serves the ruling class. False consciousness is the alarm signal revealing the presence of the enemy fifth column. There lies the essential produce of the world of alienation and the most effective killer of revolutions. Once an organization which claims the social truth adopts a lie as its tactic, its revolutionary career is finished. All positive aspects of the workers' councils must be already there in an organization which aims at their realization. All relics of the Leninist theory of organization must be fought and destroyed. The spontaneous creation of the Soviets by Russian workers in 1905 was in itself a practical critique of that baneful theory. Yet Bolsheviks continue to claim that working-class spontaneity could not go beyond, quote, trade unionism consciousness, unquote, and would be unable to grasp the, quote, totality, unquote. This was no less than a decapitation of the proletariat so that the party could place itself, quote, at the head, unquote, of the revolution. If at once you dispute the proletarian's capacity to emancipate itself, as Lenin did, so ruthlessly, then you deny the capacity to organize all aspects of post-revolutionary society. In such a context, the slogan, quote, all power to the Soviets, unquote, meant nothing more than the subjugation of the Soviets to the party, and the installation of the party state, in place of the temporary, quote, state, unquote, of armed masses. Quote, all power to the Soviets, unquote, is still the slogan, but this time without the Bolshevik afterthought. The proletariat can only play the game of revolution if the stakes are the whole world, for the only possible form of workers' power, generalized and complete autogestation, can be shared with nobody. Workers' control is the abolition of all authority. It can abide no limitation, geographical or otherwise. Any compromise amounts to surrender. Quote, workers' control must be the means and ends of the struggle. It is at once the goal of that struggle and its adequate form. A total critique of the world is the guarantee of the realism and the reality of a revolutionary organization. To tolerate the existence of an oppressive social system in one place or another, simply because it is packaged and sold as revolutionary, is to condone universal oppression. To accept alienation as inevitable in any one domain of social life is to resign oneself to reification in all its forms. It's not enough to favor workers' councils in the abstract. In concrete terms, they mean the abolition of commodities and therefore of the proletariat. Despite their superficial disparities, all existing societies are governed by the logic of commodities, and the commodity is the basis for the dreams of self-regulation. This essential fetishism is still the essential obstacle to a total emancipation, to the free construction of social life. In the world of commodities, external and invisible forces direct men's actions. Autonomous action directed towards clearly perceived goals is impossible. The strength of the economic laws lies in their ability to take on the appearance of natural ones, but it also is their weakness, for their effectiveness thus depends only on the, quote, lack of consciousness of those who help create them, unquote. The market has one central principle, the loss of self and the aimless, unconscious creation of a world beyond the control of its creators. The revolutionary core of autogestation is the attack on this principle. Autogestation is conscious direction by all of the whole existence. It is not some vision of workers' control of the market, which is merely to choose one's own alienation, to program one's own survival, squaring in the capitalist circle. The task of the workers' councils will not be autogestation of the world which exists, but a continual qualitative transformation. The commodity and its laws, the vast detour in the history of man's production of himself, will be superseded by a new social form. With autogestation ends one of the fundamental splits in modern society, between a labor which becomes increasingly reified and a leisure consumed in passivity. The death of the commodity naturally means the suppression of work and its replacement by a new type of free activity. Without firm intention, socialist groups like Socialisme ou Barbarie or Pouvoir Ouvrier fell back into the reformism of labor couched in the demands for its, quote, humanization, unquote. But it is work itself which must be called into question. Far from being a, quote, utopia, unquote, its suppression is the first condition to break from the market. The everyday division between free time and working hours, those complementary sectors of alienated life, is an expression of an internal contradiction between use value and exchange value of the commodity. It has become the strongest point of the commodity ideology, and one contradiction which intensifies with the rise of the consumer. To destroy it, no strategy short of the abolition of work will do. It is only beyond the contradiction of use value and exchange value that history begins, that men make their activity an object of their will and their consciousness, and see themselves in a world they have created. The democracy of the workers' councils is the resolution of all previous contradictions. It makes, quote, everything which exists apart from individuals impossible, unquote. What is the revolutionary project? The conscious domination of history by men who make it. Modern history, like all past history, is a product of social praxis, the unconscious result of human action. In the epoch of totalitarian control, capitalism has produced its own religion, the spectacle. In the spectacle, ideology becomes flesh of our flesh, is realized here on earth. The world itself walks upside down, and like the, quote, critique of religion, quote, in Marx's day, the critique of the spectacle is now the essential precondition of any critique. The problem of revolution is once again a concrete issue. On one side, the grandiose structures of technology and material production on the other, a dissatisfaction which can only grow more profound. The bourgeoisie and its eastern heirs, the bureaucracy, cannot devise the means to use their own overdevelopment which will be the basis for poetry of the future, simply because they both depend on the preservation of the old order. At most they harness overdevelopment to invent new repressions, for they know only one trick, the accumulation of capital, and hence of the proletariat. A proletarian being a man with no power over the use of his life, and who knows it. The new proletariat inherits the riches of the bourgeois world, and this gives it its historical chance. Its task is to transform and destroy these riches, to constitute them as part of a human project, the total appropriation of nature and of human nature by man. A realized human nature can only mean an infinite multiplication of real desires, and their gratification. These real desires are the underlife of the present society, crammed by the spectacle in the darkest corners of revolutionary unconscious, realized by the spectacle only in the dreamlike delirium of its own publicity. We must destroy the spectacle itself, the whole apparatus of commodity society, if we are to realize human needs. We must abolish those pseudo-needs and false desires which the system manufactures daily in order to preserve its power. The liberation of modern history and the free use of its hoarded acquisitions can come only from the forces it represses. In the 19th century, the proletariat was already the inheritor of philosophy. Now it inherits modern art and the first conscious critique of everyday life. With the self-destruction of the working-class art, and the philosophy shall be realized. To transform the world and to change the structure of life are one and the same thing for the proletariat. They are the passwords to its destruction as a class, its dissolution of the present reign of necessity, and its ascension to the realm of liberty. As its maximum program, it has the radical critique and free reconstruction of all values and patterns of behavior imposed by an alienated reality. The only poetry it can acknowledge is the creativity released in the making of history, the free invention of each moment and each event. L'autrement, poésie, fait partout, the beginning of the revolutionary celebration. For proletarian revolt is a festival or it is nothing. In revolution, the road of excess leads once and for all to the palace of wisdom. A palace which knows only one rationality, the game. The rules are simple. To live instead of devising lingering death, and to indulge untrammeled desire.